If you enjoy what you hear here today, please consider supporting me on my Patreon page. Every dollar helps, and you get to see content that you won't see here. Chapter 51, Part 2. 1 week later. Silver walked through the streets, his hoofsteps heavy on the cobblestones, the resounding sound seeming to echo across the empty street. It was a fairly miserable-looking day, overcast, with a biting chill on the wind that stirred the fallen red and orange-hued leaves into little whirlwinds of activity that brushed across the ground restlessly. Looking up, Silver almost expected to see a flash of lightning in the gray, overbearing clouds, or feel dripping rain on his face. The world was holding its breath, and the precipitation that he knew would soon be coming was emulating that by stubbornly refusing to fall. Upon looking outside that morning, Silver had known that this was going to be the day. He didn't want to go out when the streets were bustling with activity, as most Canterlot streets usually are. Thankfully, he only passed the occasional stranger, fellow wanderers who looked like they had too much on their minds. Without fail, they passed one another without a sound. "It's a good day for rain," he mused idly, shrugging in his coat so as to draw it closer around him. He had been putting this moment off for a few days now. Now that he had run out of time to procrastinate, it looked like it was close to rain. He sighed dejectedly. Turning his eyes back downwards, he focused again on where he was heading. He was currently walking through one of the more quaint, lesser-known areas of Canterlot. A side street that hid rickety apartments and old, dusty shops from view. Brown seemed to be the standard here. Everywhere he looked, he saw brown brick, brown mortar, brown wood, and brown metal. Even the few ponies that he saw all wore brown coats and boots. Boots. Now that would have been a good idea, Silver thought bitterly, gritting his teeth against the numbing cold on his hooves. Nevertheless, he pressed on, refusing to be dissuaded by simply a little bit of discomfort. It was like this that he walked for what seemed like an hour, but in actuality only amounted to about 15 minutes. His head was in the clouds, and he walked blindly, letting his hooves carry him to where he knew that they knew he needed to go, taking the same steps that they had taken so many times before. He gave a little start when they finally stopped, jarring him from his thoughts. He blinked and examined his surroundings to see that he was standing in front of a large, wrought iron archway that was standing over a gated entrance. The iron was carved in an intricate design of thorny roses that wreathed the words, "Rosy Glades." Silverquill grimaced. He had always hated that name. It seemed so campy then, and it seemed campy now. With a sigh and a shake of his head, Silver pushed the wrought iron gate open, frowning as flakes from the metal of rust stuck to his hoof. The distasteful peal of old hinges tore through the air, announcing his arrival as the gate opened and then closed behind him. All right, he thought, examining his surroundings. Now, where was it? He started to walk along the gravel path that cut through the grass. Short trees and small, prickly bushes that sported the occasional rose or two dotted the landscape, giving it a desolate and weathered feel, one that Silverquill imagined mirrored the feelings of most ponies who came here. Something about this place made him feel 15 years older. Casting his gaze over the many rows of markers, Silver tried to remember the last time he had been here. It seemed like so long ago. From what he could remember, it had been more than a year, at least, and that was on his father's urging. He usually tried to avoid this place. It tended to make him emotional. The rich ones all have statues of angels and guardians, he mused, and the poor ones have simple crosses or markers. He glanced at a tall marble figure of a Pegasus rearing on her hind legs, with her wings extended in a protective cocoon, carved so as to look like her entire body was draped in concealing cloth. But it doesn't make a bit of difference. Silver found himself wondering what her face looked like under her shawl. Was she smiling? Crying? Maybe both. He pushed it out of his mind. There was only one that he was looking for, and he had almost reached it. Turning away from the gravel path and walking onto the grass, following the trail of headstones to his destination, Silver found himself looking at the sky again. I hope it doesn't rain. Ahead of him, in the middle of the row, he could see what he came here for. It was a relatively unremarkable marker, not much different from the ones that surrounded it. The only thing that set it off from the others were the swirling vines of rose quartz set into the polished stone, light pink on dark gray, making for a startling contrast. Silver stopped in front of the circular headstone and sat down, ignoring the feeling of the already cold ground sapping away his body heat. Of course, the inscription was one that set it apart from the others as well. Here lies Lily Quill, beloved mother and wife, never to be forgotten. Silver couldn't help but grin. He remembered choosing the last part of that epitaph as a sort of childish ideal, that she would be remembered for hundreds and hundreds of years as the most special pony to ever live, even more so than the princesses themselves. It had only seemed appropriate then. Hey, Mom. It's been a while, he said, startling at the sound of his own voice in the profoundly quiet cemetery. I'm sorry I haven't visited in a while, I suppose. But I don't really see much point in talking to a headstone. Others say it's supposed to be therapeutic. I just say it's dumb. He shook his head and grinned ruefully. Here I am doing exactly that. What are the odds? He paused to take the time to breathe, inhaling deeply through his nose and letting it out in a deflated sigh. A lot has happened since I've last been here, he admitted. I don't really know where to start, or how. He thought for a moment. Beginning, I guess. Composing himself, raising his head and straightening his back, Silver looked straight ahead. I finally got out of Canterlot. I was coerced into taking a small vacation to get out of the city and get my mind off a few things. Get a change of scenery and such. Luna said that... He stopped when he realized that Luna hadn't returned from her lengthy banishment until after his mother's death. How strange it was to him to think about how it wasn't really too long ago that she returned. Just a few years, yet he felt like he couldn't remember a time where they weren't friends. He shook his head firmly, dislodging the errant thoughts from his mind. Never mind, he amended. I'll just say that it was all organized by a friend in high places. He paused, collecting himself for a moment before continuing. I was apprehensive at first, as you can probably guess, but I felt like I didn't have anything to lose, so I boarded the train to a small town called Ponyville. It's a nice place. A lot of gorgeous scenery, lots of friendly ponies. You would have loved it, considering how much you would complain about Canterlot. He drew in a breath to continue speaking, but stopped. Then he drew another one and then stopped again. I met some ponies there that I can now call my friends. His voice was hesitant and unsure. You used to always bug me about staying in my room so much and not going out to make friends, saying that I was missing out on the best things in life. Well, I can now say that I understand what you were getting at back then. He found himself grinning without even realizing it. It really is nice. There's one pony, however, I've gotten to know a little better more than the others, he said, swallowing a dry lump in his throat. How silly he must have looked talking to this headstone, this poor representation of his mother. He had to resist the urge to twist his head around and make sure there was no pony secretly watching him, likely giggling behind their hooves as they watched his ridiculousness. Her name is Twilight Sparkle, and she's a lot like me, actually. Loves books, not very many friends, susceptible to occasional bouts of social awkwardness. He made a face on that last point, but he knew in his heart that it was true. She's incredibly smart, though, he added. Incredibly smart and talented. You remember all that hubbub in the news back when I was still a colt about Celestia accepting a unicorn filly as her personal student? Well, that filly was her. He took a moment to appreciate what that really meant. Yep. I'm friends with the most powerful unicorn in Equestria. How cool is that? His face lit up in a smile for a moment, before quickly being replaced with an uncertain expression. Only, it's a little bit more than that, he admitted quietly. It's a pretty funny story, actually. I ran into her once, quite literally when I was a colt. I sort of developed a crush on her. Silver's face flushed in embarrassment. And then, when I realized that my friend had organized me to stay with her in Ponyville during my vacation, I was so surprised that I couldn't even speak. Silver remembered the moment he had first walked through the front door of that library and beheld its caretaker. He had been so surprised that he could have understandably been mistaken for an incredibly detailed statue. Well, at first, everything was all right, Silver continued on. Spent a lot of time wandering around Ponyville, cleaning all the dust and cobwebs out of my head, enjoying the simplicity and whatnot. Things started to get a bit more complicated. Silver tasted the words in his mouth and grimaced. This was really awkward. I found myself becoming more and more, I don't know, fascinated by her, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. She seemed to be the most interesting pony I had ever met. I could hardly take my eyes off her for more than a few moments. Every time she spoke, I found myself listening as though my life depended on it. At first, I was confused beyond measure. I was trying to get back to riding, but found myself continually distracted by even the simple thought of her. He gave a rueful grin. Little had I known that harmless crush had come back in full force. Before I knew it, I could do nothing else but think of her. Just by walking into a room, she seemed to make everything brighter. She could talk for hours on end about the most boring subjects, and I'd be completely invested just because I could hear the sound of her voice. All it would take is a blink in my direction, and I'd be struggling to keep my hooves under me. She would... Silver abruptly stopped when he realized what he was saying, and that he was grinning like a fool without even realizing it. He could almost hear the deceased mare giggling at him. Flushing slightly, he straightened. Well, you get the point, He paused for a moment, thinking to himself as he gazed into the shiny, slightly weathered stone. He could just about make out his reflection in the marble. Do you remember when I asked you and Dad what it felt like to be in love? Silver asked softly. Dad told me that it was like having the most glorious disease in the world. One that ached so strongly that it felt like it was eating you alive. But never, in a million years, would you willingly be rid of it. A tiny smile graced his features. I didn't understand then. But I do now. Somewhat. He took a moment to look up and examine the sky. Still gray and cloudy. Looked like it was going to open up on him any minute. I'll be honest, Mom. I was terrified, Silver said absently, not taking his eyes away from the heavens. For a while, I was so scared that the thought of confessing my feelings would make me want to throw up. At first I thought it was just nerves born from inexperience, but eventually, after a little help from my friend, I realized it was more than that. Silver continued looking up at the sky for a good long minute, absently wondering when the first raindrop was going to fall. After a good minute of simply staring, he finally turned his head back down to look at the headstone. I was afraid of breaking a promise that I made long ago, he whispered, nearly inaudibly. He waited for a moment, as though expecting the grave to reply. When it didn't, he did the only thing he could think of, and continued talking. But you can rest assured that I managed to overcome that fear, he announced proudly. I opened myself up, more so than I have with any pony before. He halted for a moment, cocking an ear to the wind. How did it go, you ask? Well, he grinned. Let's just say that I've never felt happier in my entire life than I did in that moment. I don't think I can even begin to describe it. Silver sat there, smiling as he remembered the moment that Twilight said without a hint of doubt that she returned his affections for her. All of a sudden, the cold didn't seem to bother him as much as before. Well, to make a long story short, I'm going to be leaving Canterlot. I'm going to move to Ponyville. He smiled ruefully. I've had more than enough of this city, to be honest. It used to be so shiny and fascinating when I was younger, but now it's just, well, not. I've already got everything set up. First thing tomorrow, I'm taking everything that I need and taking the train to Ponyville, where I'll be renting a small apartment. Silver had a little bit of money stashed away. Money he had earned from writing his 2 published books and a myriad of short stories throughout the years. Enough to make the transition from Canterlot to Ponyville as smooth as possible. He'll be taking quite a chunk out of his savings, though, but given the circumstances, he thought that to be a small price to pay. His smile slowly started to fade. So, yeah. I'm leaving Canterlot. I probably won't be able to visit you in quite some time. Lowering his head, he sighed. I know I haven't visited you in such a long time already, and I'm sorry for that. I've been busy with my writing and stuff, and I live pretty far from here, and... A drop of water hit the ground in front of him, causing him to look up and scowl. Oh, for crying out loud. Silver waited to see how bad the rain was going to be. If it was just going to be a light drizzle, he'd be fine, but if there was going to be a downpour, he was going to have to cut his time short. To his surprise, however, he didn't feel any rain, nor could he see any falling around him, which confused him as he could very clearly hear the quiet drip of water hitting the ground close by. His eyes then widened with realization. "Oh," he murmured, slowly lifting a hoof and touching the side of his face. He felt moisture there, a wetness that had nothing to do with the weather. A shudder went through his body, forcing a pained grunt from his throat. I'm sorry. He gasped instinctively, trying to hold back the tidal wave that he knew was soon going to crash down upon him. Gritting his teeth, he squeezed his eyes shut. "Be strong for me," he heard a sickly voice in his head say. With another convulsion, Silver's eyes flew open again, wide as saucers. He stared at the gravestone for a long moment, completely motionless, save for the smallest twitch of his hoof or eye. "Mom," he whispered, his face starting to screw up as the tidal wave broke free and fell upon him. I promise." Finally, not being able to bear the strain anymore, Silver bowed his head and let out a wail of grief. His vision immediately became foggy, as tears long repressed started to flow freely. He was racked with convulsing sobs that shook him to his core, as he cried for the first time in 2 decades. "I promise," he repeated, saying it nearly incoherently over and over again like it was a chant. "I promise. I promise." He collapsed to his stomach onto the sparse grass. Now he truly didn't mind the cold, although his coat protected him from the worst of it. The sharp feeling of icy pins served a welcome reminder that, even though she may be long dead and buried, he was alive. Silver didn't know how long he stayed like that, crying over the patch of dirt that Quill was buried in, his tears soaking into the sparse ground in time to his cries. It felt like hours, but it could have been no more than 2 minutes. All that he was aware of were the tears that would not stop falling. He didn't even notice when it finally did start raining. The rocking and rolling of the train car was making Silver drowsy, but he forced himself to stay awake. In between his hooves, he held a book, the romance novel that had caught his eye in Twilight's library that he had requested to take out, resulting in many giggles in his direction from the librarian. His eyes flicked back and forth across the pages, occasionally rising to glance out the window and appreciate the scenery as it sped by. Rolling hills and tall trees surrounded him, with jagged mountain peaks peeking over the top in the distance. He could just make out the Camelot Palace from where he was, its golden spires glinting in the light. Luna was probably up there in her room, the one situated in the highest tower, sleeping the day away in preparation for her night. Silver smiled as he remembered the Princess of the Night's reaction to his announcement that he was leaving Camelot. At first, she was surprised, almost hurt even, but when he had explained his reasoning, she had been so overjoyed that she had picked him up between 2 hooves like a ragdoll and squeezed him in a crushing hug. "This is fantastic news, young Silver Quill!" she had cried gleefully as she attempted to break his ribs. "Fantastic news indeed! I am most happy for you!" Silver could have sworn that he had noticed a hint of satisfaction in her eyes, but it was gone before he could think anything of it. She wasn't the only one who was excited either. Silver's father had been a curious mixture of ecstatic and melancholic about the news. He was so happy for Silver that he had found a some pony that he could love, but the fact that she was going to be taking his son away from him to a strange town had hit him fairly hard. He had had a bit of a cry over that, bemoaning the cruelties of the world that his little colt should be stolen away from him so soon. But in the end, he was happy for him, although he had threatened to smack him upside the head when Silver ashamedly told him about how long it took for him to get a hold of his feelings. I wish your mother could see this, he had said fondly. Our little Silver moving away from home for a girl. She never would have believed it. They had spent the whole day together, walking around Canterlot and catching each other up on what they had been doing. His father demanded that Silver tell him everything he could about this mystery mare that had him leaving, and Silver had been more than happy to oblige. I can see it in your eyes, Silver. Last time I saw you this happy was when you got a signed copy of that book you liked so much, he had told his son with a smile. And Silver had laughed at that. His signed copy of Wings of Iron, the story of a scrappy young Pegasus caught up in a war between ponies and the Griffins, was still one of his most prized possessions. His smile slowly faded as his thoughts turned to the day before, at the graveyard. Sighing, Silver closed his book and set it aside. The recollection of sitting on the cold ground with nothing but a small coat to prevent him from the rain made him shiver instinctively, but he had hardly felt it at the time. He had spent almost an hour in that exact same spot, shedding so many tears that he wouldn't be surprised if he had somehow permanently damaged his tear ducts. Years and years worth of pent-up sadness had all broken free yesterday, like a dam bursting under the force of a raging river. Despite this, Silver couldn't help but feel a strange sort of relief. It was like an enormous burden had finally been set down, one that he'd been carrying for so long that he'd actually forgotten it was there. It was like being a caged bird that had, for the first time in its life, spread its wings and tasted freedom. He breathed in deeply, wearing a serene smile. He couldn't help but marvel at how much he had changed in the past few weeks. His entire life had been completely uprooted, turned and twisted as though it were a Rubik's Cube in the hooves of a child, and then set down miles away from where it was picked up, namely in a small town called Ponyville. Silver started when the squeal of metal grinding on metal peeled through the train. Looking out the window, he could see a platform milling with ponies, a few creatures of other races interspersed in the multicolored crowd. Sitting up, his eyes eagerly scanned the crowd of ponies standing on the station, passing over one face before immediately jumping to the next. He saw couples sitting side by side, families wandering in groups, individuals sitting around with bored expressions on their faces, but he did not see the one he was looking for. Picking up his carry-on bag, Silver quickly got up and walked to the end of the train to the storage compartment, threading his way through ponies sitting up and heading for the doors. He quickly located his luggage, suitcases, and duffel bags filled with clothes, books, and everything else he would foreseeably need until the rest of his stuff arrived from Canterlot. Lighting up his horn and telekinetically grabbing his stuff, Silver quickly made his way to the exit of the train. Careful not to accidentally bump his bags into anything or any pony on the way. His books were in there after all. Walking through the door, Silver felt a slight tug from behind. Turning around, he realized that carrying all of his luggage out at the same time was not as good of an idea as he might have thought, as they were all stuffed in the doorway that was too narrow for them to fit through all at once. Grimacing, Silver wrapped a hoof around an exposed handle and gave a mighty tug. The luggage came loose, but Silver was thrown backwards as it all crashed on top of him, sending him sprawling. He let out a pained oof as a suitcase hit him right in the stomach, knocking the wind out of him. Silver lay on his back on the wooden platform floor, discombobulated and wheezing. Around him, ponies looked on, some with amusement and others with sympathy, but they all had their own business to attend to, so they simply passed by him.
Woo-wee, you sure took a tumble there,
a voice said from above him, an orange face appearing in his field of view.
You all right down there?
Silver grinned weakly at the Stetson-wearing pony. Hey, Applejack, he replied. We've got to start meeting in different places. The apple farmer smirked.
Whatever you say, Silver, but I think y'all got a more important problem right now.
She reached out with her hoof, and Silver gratefully took it before she hauled him to his hoof so quickly that she almost knocked him off of them again. Whoa! Thanks, he said as he focused on keeping his legs underneath him. So, what do you mean, more important problem? Before Applejack could say anything, a familiar voice called out from behind him.
Silver!
His ears perked immediately, and he spun around to see a lavender mare trotting towards him with a worried look on her face.
Are you okay?
She asked, closing the distance between them and looking him up and down. Silver's face reddened. Saw that, did you? He asked with embarrassment.
We all did, dude,
came an amused voice from above. Silver looked up to see Rainbow hovering with crossed hooves and a smirk on her face.
Quite the crash you had there.
Silver spied 3 more ponies walking towards them through the crowd. Fluttershy with a similarly worried expression on her face, Pinkie Pie bouncing without a care in the world, and Rarity with a grinning dragon whelpling on her back.
Oh, goodness,
Fluttershy cried, although it really sounded more like she just said it in what most would consider a normal tone of voice.
Are you all right?
His embarrassment deepening, Silver nodded. I'm fine, he reassured them. Just a bit of a bruise to my pride. Rainbow snorted from where she hovered, causing Twilight to shoot her a disapproving look. The Pegasus just smiled sheepishly.
Well, as long as you're okay, and we're okay, and every pony's okay, then everything is A-okay.
A chipper voice cried as Pinkie Pie bounced over and picked up one of the bags with her teeth.
And that's a good thing.
Rarity rolled her eyes and smiled.
Indeed, Pinkie, it is a good thing.
Turning her attention to Silver Quill, who was frantically picking up his fallen possessions, she gave a small chuckle.
You sure know how to make an entrance, don't you?
Attempting to pull his bag from Pinkie Pie's mouth, who seemed to think that they were playing a game of tug-of-war, Silver smiled. Right. Whatever you say, he said as he telekinetically lifted both the bag and the mare off the ground, causing her to fall off with a laugh. With his stuff now all in order and sitting next to him, Silver looked at the mares who were watching him expectantly. His eyes lingered on Twilight's for half a second more. Well, I'm home, he said with a shrug. What now? All at once, they broke into big smiles and immediately started to walk him away from the station, chatting away about what they had to do now that he was officially a resident of Ponyville. Much to Silver's delight, Twilight immediately fell in beside him, telekinetically lifting some of his bags. He gave her a smile, one that spoke of far more than just a simple thanks, and she returned it in kind. To his utter non-surprise, Rarity seemed to notice this and gave a small, self-satisfied smile that nobody but him noticed. I'm home, he thought with an immense amount of satisfaction, looking around him at the ponies milling about, and occasionally glancing back at Twilight. And there's nowhere else I'd rather be. As they stepped off of the station, Pinkie Pie suddenly let out a loud gasp, immediately drawing attention to her.
I just realized something,
she declared in an awestruck voice.
This means that I can throw a welcome back to Ponyville party for Silver Quill!
The group sighed in equal measures of amusement and disbelief. As they walked, Pinkie rambled on and on about what they were going to do for this welcome back to Ponyville party. Normally, Silver might have found himself becoming slightly annoyed by this. But right now, he found that he didn't mind her ramblings at all. There was only one thing in the world that was important to him right now. And with her walking right next to him, Silver just couldn't find the heart to worry about anything else.